Good evening. How are you? It's great to be with you on a Wednesday. Let's light up the darkness. And who is going to be learning with us right here in the middle of the week? Yehuda in South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Stephen in New Hampshire. Great to be back home. Bella in Florida, Nancy in North Carolina, Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Belle in North Texas, James in Annapolis, Joseph in Massachusetts, Joe in the Inland Empire, Patrice in Tennessee, Sam in Central Virginia. Welcome. And over there on the YouTube side, I'm not in the window. Hold on, give me 1 second. Come on. There it is. And over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. You know what love is? Love is tearing yourself away from your obsession because of people you care about. Over there, that's the editing room for our movie man in the long black coat. I'm in that state of utter obsession. I really love the editing process of a movie, just putting together the pieces, and just, time disappears when I'm in that world. But every night at 6, it's you, my dear sisters and brothers, that I want to be with. So let's get to it. Tonight's daf, page Lamed Zayin, page 37, here in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 6, still discussing Mishnah number 1. It's been challenging these last few days, understanding how the rabbis derive the parameters and nuances of the prohibition of one who takes a vow of Naziris. What exactly is prohibited? We know he can't drink wine. He can't eat grapes. Can he eat 2 seeds in a grape skin? No, he cannot. Can he eat branches and leaves of the grapevine? Yes, he can. And how do we know those things? We've been looking at some of the exegetical principles that the sages use to derive laws, sort of rabbinic decrees out of written Torah laws. And we're continuing that discussion today. And it's really interesting stuff if you just go with it. Don't worry if it's a little confusing. After a while, it starts to come into focus. Okay, 37a, we pick it up near the top. So Abaye said to Rav Dimi, from where do you derive that this verse about the Nazir, nor shall he drink anything soaked in grapes, right? And as we saw, when the Torah spells out the prohibitions of the Nazir, it doesn't just say it once. Okay, he can't eat grapes. He can't eat produce of the grapevine. It says it several times, and that's how we got into the discussion of restrictions and amplifications, or details and generalizations. Now, one of the details that's given is not only cannot eat grapes, not only can he not drink wine or vinegar or strong drink made from grapes, but it also says in the Torah at number 6:3, nor shall he drink anything soaked in grapes. So Abaye says to Rav Dimi, from where do you derive that this verse, nor shall he drink anything soaked in grapes, that this verse comes to teach the principle that permitted food combines with forbidden food, as stated by Rabbi Yochanan a couple of pages ago, right? So we've been talking about, so some things are just absolutely prohibited. You can't even have a minuscule amount. But most things, if it's a prohibited substance, there's a minimum amount of that substance that you'd have to consume in order to trigger liability for violating the prohibition. And what we've been discussing is, I'm reminded, like there was a legal problem some years ago for people who use drugs, right? That there was the carrier problem, right? So like people who like to take LSD, if they put a drop of LSD on a sugar cube, which I guess was a way that some people used to do LSD, so then the weight of the sugar cube became the weight of the prohibited substance to which a person was held liable and sentenced to years in prison. Because whereas a drop of LSD, I don't know exactly how LSD works, but it's very, very powerful. You just put that drop, on your tongue and you're tripping for hours. You put that drop on a sugar cube and eat the sugar cube, same trip. But now, instead of the weight of the one drop, it's the weight of the sugar cube, which if it was pure LSD, it would make sense that the person should go to prison for 20 years because those are doses, for hundreds or thousands of people. But because they put it on a sugar cube, it assumed that substance. And likewise here, right? If you take just a little bit of wine and, you take some wine, you soak some bread in it, and then you squeeze out the wine. So there's really very little wine there, less than the minimum amount. But now that it's combined with bread, right? So the bread is adding weight and volume to this mixture, and now it might trigger liability because now you've got that minimum volume, and the minimum volume is an olive bulk, right? So until you've consumed an olive bulk of grape or grape produce, wine, etc., you haven't triggered liability for violating that prohibition. So we've been discussing this question of whether permitted food combines with forbidden food to establish, that minimum amount. But now Abaye is saying, well, wait a minute. Maybe we've been deriving the wrong principle from this phrase and this verse in the Torah that pertains to the Nazir about his bread soaked in wine. We've been talking about what's the minimum amount to trigger liability. What if it's not about minimum amounts? What if it's about a different principle altogether? That the question is whether the prohibited substance imparts its flavor onto the mixture or not. And if it doesn't impart flavor, then it might be in a different category than something that does impart flavor. Right? So it says Abaye to Rav Dimi. From where do you derive that this verse about anything soaked in that bread and that the Nazir shall not drink anything soaked in grapes, that this comes to teach the principle that permitted food combines with forbidden food, as stated by Rabbi Yochanan about the minimum measure? Perhaps instead it comes to establish the principle that the legal status of the flavor of a forbidden food is like that of its substance. And this principle states that any food that absorbs the taste of a forbidden item assumes the status of the forbidden item itself. Interesting. So the Gemara expresses surprise at Abaye's question. And according to the opinion of Abaye, initially, that which Rav Dimi said was difficult for him, right? About the combining to establish the minimum measure. And Rav Dimi had cited Rabbi Yochanan as saying that permitted food combines with forbidden foods only in the case of a Nazir due to this term, soaked. And Abaye had objected with all these aforementioned refutations of that we covered in the last 2 days to prove that this principle applies in all areas of Torah law, that prohibited and permitted substances can combine to establish a minimum measure, if not all areas of Torah, at least many other areas of Torah law. And that's what Abaye brought down, all these other areas where we saw that permitted and prohibited substances combined to establish a minimum measure. So we thought that's what the conversation was all about. And yet, he then said to him that one should derive a very different principle from that same verse, that the verse establishes the principle that the legal status of the flavor of a forbidden food is like that of its substance. What's going on? Why did Abaye shift the argument to a whole new area? He was winning. He was bringing all these good proofs to establish that it meant something else, and now he's changing the subject, as it were. What's going on? So the Gemara answers, after Rav Dimi resolved Abaye's difficulties, and Abaye had accepted his answer, that the principle that permitted food combines with forbidden food does not apply to the rest of Torah law, but rather only to the case of the Nazir. So then he said to Rav Dimi, well, perhaps the verse comes to establish that the legal status of the flavor of forbidden food is like that of its substance, with the following application. And this is relevant for that which is taught in a baraisa. The term soaked, right, that the Nazir shall not eat anything soaked in wine, it serves to establish the principle that the legal status of the flavor of a forbidden food is like that of its substance, right? So even if you're not going to eat that minimum measure, even if you're not going to eat any of the prohibited substance, but somehow its flavor was extracted and imparted onto a different substance that is permitted, but now tastes like wine, right? This idea that it was soaked in wine, and then we took the wine out of it, but it still tastes like wine. So even though the carrier, right, of this wine flavor is not wine or any produce of the grapevine, now that it tastes like wine, it must be prohibited to the Nazir, right? This is what he's asking now, what Abai is asking. As if a Nazir soaked grapes in water, and the water has the taste of wine, he is liable to receive punishment for drinking this liquid, as it assumes the status of wine. Even though it's made purely of water, the fact that it got some wine flavor, some grape flavor into the water is enough to render it prohibited to the Nazir. And from here, you derive the law with regard to all prohibitions of the Torah. In all cases, the legal status of the taste of a forbidden food is like eating the forbidden food. And the fact that with regard to all other prohibitions, the legal status of the flavor of the forbidden food is like the food itself is derived from the laws of Nazir, right? The fact that you can't eat something that has absorbed the flavor of a prohibited food, where do we get that law? Here, from the laws of the Nazir. So the Baraisa explains the derivation. And just as with regard to a Nazir whose prohibition against eating grapes is not a permanent prohibition. Why is it not a permanent prohibition? Because his Naziris is temporary. Once his term of Naziris ends, he can return to eating grapes. So it's a strict prohibition while he's a Nazir, but it is a temporary prohibition. Since this is not a permanent prohibition, as he will be permitted to eat grapes once his term of Naziris is over, and furthermore, his prohibition is not a prohibition against deriving benefit from wine. A Nazir can own a bottle of wine, he can't consume it. He can sell a bottle of wine, he just can't consume it. And there is a way to permit his prohibition against eating grape products by requesting from a halakhic authority to dissolve his vow. So in all these ways, the prohibition of a Nazir to consume wine is limited. He absolutely can't drink it. But there's all these aspects of that prohibition that are somewhat weak, in the sense it's temporary, and it could be dissolved if he has that vow dissolved by a halakhic authority, and he can derive benefit from it even though he can't consume it. He can own it or sell it. So in all these cases, nonetheless, right, he cannot consume it for sure. And nevertheless, in his case, the Torah rendered the legal status of the flavor of food like that of its substance, right? Even though his prohibition is weakened in all these ways, that it's temporary, that it can be dissolved, and that he can still derive benefit from it, and nonetheless, if the flavor of the wine is imparted onto water, he cannot drink that water, then all the more so, when we talk about substances that are absolutely prohibited, that are permanent prohibitions, that you can't derive benefit from it, and you can't have that prohibition dissolved by a halakhic authority, all the more that they would, if that prohibited substance imparted its flavor on something, that thing would have to be prohibited, right? So if the relatively weak prohibition of wine for the Nazir, still the flavor is like eating the prohibited substance itself, then all the more so in prohibitions that are permanent and can't be dissolved and you can't derive benefit from them, if they impart their flavor onto something, of course, that substance, that permitted substance that now has the flavor of something prohibited, will be prohibited. Right? That's the proof that's being offered to us. Right? So then, with regard to a forbid, And nevertheless, so with regard to a forbidden mixture of diverse kinds in a vineyard, right? So we know that this prohibition of kilayim, that if you plant diverse species together, too close together, that's prohibited. Double prohibition if you plant two crops very close together and one of them is a vineyard, right? If you plant some wheat in a vineyard, you cannot eat that wheat, right? If you're an observant Jew, because it was a mixture of diverse kinds and in a vineyard, double prohibition. So with regard to a forbidden mixture of diverse kinds in a vineyard, for example, grain seeds sown together with grape seeds, whose prohibition is a permanent prohibition, and whose prohibition is a prohibition against deriving benefit. Not only can you not eat the grapes or the wheat that were grown in that plot together, but you can't even sell them and get money for that. You can't derive benefit from it. And there is no way to permit their prohibition. You can't have a halakhic authority dissolve this prohibition, and it is not a temporary prohibition, it is a permanent prohibition. So is it not right that the Torah should render the legal status of the flavor of its forbidden food like eating the prohibited food itself? Now the Baraisa adds, and the same is true for the prohibition against eating the fruit of a tree during the first 3 years after its planting, on 2 of the 3 counts. Now we're talking about orla. Right, so when you plant a fruit tree, the fruit that comes from that tree for its first 3 years of life is prohibited. That's called orla. Then in the 4th year, you can start to eat it. So we say in 2 of these 3 respects, because this one is a temporary prohibition, like the prohibition of wine to a Nazir. Eventually, you can eat the fruit of this tree, but during the first 3 years, you can't. Nevertheless, you cannot derive benefit from it, and you cannot have that prohibition dissolved. So one of the sages said to Abaye, and so if that fruit of orla, because it has 2 of those 3 prohibitions in place, that's stronger than wine for a Nazir, so if you imparted flavor from this fruit, from a particular fruit that was taken from a 3-year-old or younger tree, and you mix that flavor into something else, then that other thing would become prohibited. Now one of the sages said to Abaye, when Rabbi Bahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the principle of permitted food combining with forbidden food is derived from the term soaked, right? So now we're answering Abaye's objection that, well, wait a minute. Now we were talking about whether permitted and prohibited foods combine to form a minimum amount that triggers liability. And now Abaye has brought this other idea that, well, actually that same verse that you've been using to teach about the combination of permitted and prohibited foods to form the amount to trigger liability, the minimum amount. And now Abaye is saying, well, wait a minute, maybe what we should be learning from that is that the flavor of a prohibited substance is like eating the prohibited substance itself. So now one of the sages is answering Abaye and saying, when Rabbi Bahu said that Rabbi Yochanan said that the principle of permitted food combining with forbidden food is derived from the term soaked, he spoke in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and in this matter, Rabbi Akiva is in the minority. And the Gemara asks, to which statement of Rabbi Akiva is the Gemara referring? If we say it is referring to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva from our Mishna, as we learned that Rabbi Akiva says, even if a Nazir soaked his bread in wine, and the bread and wine contain enough to combine to constitute an olive bulk, he is liable, right? The carrier problem, that there's not enough wine to form an olive bulk, but if it's combined with an olive bulk of bread and that wine has, gotten throughout the bread in this little bit of volume, it triggers liability for eating the minimum amount. And the sages say, I'm not sure, but Akiva says that's the way it is. So Akiva says, even if a Nazir soaked his bread in wine and the combination is an olive bulk, he is liable. But from where do we know that Rabbi Akiva means an olive bulk taken from the bread and the wine together? Perhaps that ruling applies only when there's actually an olive bulk of wine, combined with whatever amount of bread, and now when he eats that bread soaked in wine, what he's actually consuming is a whole olive bulk worth of wine. It's not that the mixture is the olive bulk, it's that there is an olive bulk of wine, soaked into some amount of bread. He eats that whole amount of bread, so he's got a whole olive bulk worth of wine in his mouth. And if you would say, well, in that case, what is the purpose of stating this ruling? We know that if you consume an olive bulk worth of wine, you have violated the prohibition of a Nazir to drink wine. Rather, the reference... So what is the novelty of Rabbi Akiva's statement if the mixture already contains an olive bulk of wine? Well, one can say that it serves to exclude the opinion of the first Tana who said that he is liable only if he drinks a quarter log of wine. Somebody else had a larger measure as the minimum measure to trigger liability for a Nazir drinking wine. Rabbi Akiva emphasizes that no, it's an olive bulk. Do we understand him to mean a combination of bread and wine forms the olive bulk, or it has to be a completely wine to be that olive bulk? So rather, the reference is to the following statement of Rabbi Akiva in a Baraisa. As it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Akiva says, a Nazir who soaked his bread in wine and ate an olive bulk of the mixture of bread and wine is liable. So this Baraisa indicates that according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, a permitted substance does combine with a prohibited substance to form the minimum volume to trigger liability. So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia, said to Rav Ashi, according to Rabbi Akiva, who establishes the verse, neither shall he drink anything soaked, that we're talking about, as referring to the principle that permitted combines with forbidden, to form the minimum volume, from where does he derive the principle that the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself, right? Now we're saying this is the verse that teaches us that the flavor of something prohibited is like eating the prohibited thing itself. So if Rabbi Akiva is not deriving that principle from this verse about being soaked in bread, and we know that it's true that you cannot, impart a prohibited flavor onto even permitted food and then eat that permitted food if it's got that prohibited flavor. So then where does Rabbi Akiva get that principle from? And the Gemara answers, Akiva derives this principle from the prohibition of meat cooked in milk. Is it not the case that there is no actual milk present? Like if you cook meat in milk and then you remove the meat from the milk, even though you left the milk behind, now, the milk imparted some flavor onto the meat, and that's why the meat is prohibited, is what the Gemara is suggesting would be Akiva's proof text for the flavor of something prohibited is prohibited, like eating the thing itself. So is it not the case that there's no actual milk present and it is merely the taste of the milk absorbed in the meat, and yet the mixture is prohibited? So here too, in the case of other prohibitions, it is no different, and the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself. And the Gemara asks, and with regard to the rabbis, and let's just review for a second, right? This is the most fundamental principle of kashrus, right? Of kosher food, is that we don't eat milk and meat together. Now, what does the Torah say? You shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And it says it 3 times. And I haven't actually reviewed this, but just pulling it from memory, I'm pretty sure. It says it 3 times, and from that, we derive that you cannot eat milk and meat cooked together. You cannot derive benefit from milk and meat cooked together. And you cannot you cannot eat meat and milk that are cooked together. You cannot derive benefit from meat and milk that are cooked together. And you cannot cook meat and milk together even if you don't eat it. Right? So those 3 prohibitions are involved in eating milk and meat from the 3 times the Torah states you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Okay. So the Gemara asks, and with regard to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva and derive the law that the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself from the phrase about the Nazir, neither shall he eat anything soaked in the wine. So why do they not derive this principle from the case of meat cooked in milk? And the Gemara answers, the rabbis claim that we do not derive other prohibitions from meat cooked in milk because that prohibition is a novelty. And one does not learn general laws from unusual cases. And the Gemara asks, what is the novelty of that prohibition? If we say that it is unique in that this meat alone and that milk alone are each permitted, right? You can eat meat, kosher meat, and you can eat kosher milk. You just can't have them together, all right? So is that what's unique about this? But it's also, for the Nazir, he can eat bread, but he cannot drink any wine, right? That wine is absolutely prohibited to him. So that's different than the milk and meat, which would be permitted to a Jew separately, but are prohibited when combined. Just like wheat is permitted and, grapes are permitted, but if they're grown together, then they become prohibited. So they're permitted when apart, and yet together they are forbidden. Well, that characteristic is not unique to meat cooked in milk. In the case of forbidden mixtures of diverse kinds, also this element alone, and that element alone are each permitted, and yet together they are forbidden. So that's not what's unique about the prohibition against eating meat cooked in milk. So the Gemara answers, rather, the novelty of the Torah prohibiting meat cooked in milk is that if one soaks meat in milk all day, it is permitted by Torah law, despite the fact that the meat certainly absorbs some taste of the milk. Whereas if one cooked meat in milk for even a minute, the mixture is forbidden by Torah law. So interesting. No, you cannot eat meat that was soaking in milk all day long. But that's by rabbinic decree. By Torah law, if meat was sitting in milk, for hours, but then you removed it from the milk and there was no cooking, it was never heated, right? Then the meat would be permitted because it was never cooked in the milk. And then once you removed it, you're not eating the milk and meat combination anymore. Now, by rabbinic decree, they're going to say that's too close to the edge and we're going to prohibit that. But by Torah law, it's permitted, despite the fact that the meat certainly absorbs some taste of the milk. Whereas, if one cooked meat in milk even for a short time, the mixture is forbidden by Torah law because the Torah prohibits cooking meat in milk. So the novelty is that it is not the fact that they are mixed together that renders meat and milk forbidden by Torah law, but the act of cooking. So the Gemara asks, and Rabbi Akiva too, he certainly agrees that the law of meat cooked in milk is a novelty, so how can he derive a general principle from this case? Rather, now we're on 37b, Rabbi Akiva derives the principle that the legal status of the flavor of a prohibited food is like eating the prohibited food itself. He derives this from the vessels of Gentiles that require purging, where the Jews were commanded to purge the non-kosher flavor from the vessels that they seized from the Midianites. This was in a battle when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, and there was a war against the Midianites. And then there's a story told right in the Torah that afterwards they were able to seize the weapons and vessels of the enemy soldiers, and they were able to kosher them, right? They were able to render them kosher. How did they do that? By passing them through the fire, right? So that's why you can kosher things that are metal. You can kosher a metal pot, even if it has had non-kosher things in it. But you cannot kosher, something that will not pass through the fire. There's so many laws of what's kosher and what's not, and how to render vessels kosher or not. There's also immersing them in the mikveh. There's another aspect to it, way beyond the scope of what we're talking today. But let's just continue with this. So Rabbi Akiva is going to derive this principle that the flavor, if it imparts the flavor, it's like eating the prohibited substance itself. It's going to take that principle from this law of koshering the vessels of the Gentiles, in this case the Midianites. As the Merciful One states in the section of the Torah that deals with this battle and the aftermath, Numbers 31:23, everything that passes through the fire, you shall make it pass through the fire. And that is to say that the vessels of Gentiles that require purging are forbidden to be used until they have been purged through fire and purified. Now, isn't there mere taste absorbed in the vessels through the process of cooking? And even so, these vessels are forbidden if this purging was not performed. So here too, with regard to other matters of Torah law, it is no different, and the legal status of the flavor is like that of the substance itself. Right? If you have a clean pot, like you totally cleaned it, super clean, you cleaned and rinsed it 1,000 times, and it's like does not look or taste or smell at all like it had, the flavor of previous foods that were cooked in it. which it belonged to Gentiles. So non-kosher foods were cooked in it, which is certainly permitted for them, but prohibited for us. And so why, once the pot's been thoroughly cleaned, is it not, can we not use it? Why does it have to be koshered? Why does it have to be rendered kosher? By passing it through the fire to make sure that none of the flavor of the previous foods that were cooked in it remain in that pot. That's what passing through the fire does. And so from that, Rabbi Akiva would learn out that the flavor of a prohibited substance in your food is like eating the prohibited substance itself. Now, Rav Acha further suggested to Rav Ashi, and according to the opinion of the rabbis who derive this principle from neither shall it be soaked from the law of the Nazir, so why don't the rabbis also derive it from the vessels of the Gentiles that require purging, as Rabbi Akiva does? And Rav Ashi said to him, the rabbis maintain that the law of purging vessels of Gentiles is also a novelty. And what is the novelty of this law? As with regard to all dietary laws in the Torah, anything that gives flavor, i.e. contributes taste, that renders the food tainted, is permitted. If the taste added by the forbidden food does not enhance the permitted food, it does not render that food forbidden. This is fascinating. If the prohibited substance improves the flavor of the permitted food, then the permitted food is prohibited. But if the flavor of the prohibited substance when added to the permitted food detracts from the flavor of the permitted food, then it's permitted. This is obviously has some policy considerations, right? Like, we're not gonna, for the sake of people, who are buying used pots and pans or something like that, the sages were generous and say, okay, we're not gonna make you get new pots and pans, willy-nilly. But if you think that you can, enhance the flavor of permitted food by using a prohibited, the flavor of a prohibited substance, think again. That you cannot do. But here, with regard to the law of vessels of Gentiles that require purging, the Torah states that even if they contribute taste that renders the food tainted, even if the taste is a detraction, nevertheless they are forbidden until they pass through the fire. So if 24 hours have passed since food was cooked in a pot, the assumption is that the flavor released from the pot will contribute a deleterious taste to any foods subsequently cooked in the pot. Even so, vessels taken from Gentiles remain forbidden until they have been purged, despite the fact that the taste they contribute taints the food. So the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva too, the case of vessels of Gentiles that require purging is apparently a novelty. So how can Rabbi Akiva derive that the flavor of forbidden food is like eating the forbidden food itself from the purging of the vessels of the Gentiles, if that also presents this problem of it's kind of a unique case? So Rabbi Akiva derives this principle from the required purging of the vessels of the Gentiles. How then does he respond to the previous claim? Rav Huna, the son of Hiya, said the Torah prohibited the use of unpurged vessels of Gentiles only in the case of a pot that was used on that day, which is not the case when the pot gives flavor that renders the food tainted, which is after 24 hours. So accordingly, it is not a novelty that the vessels were forbidden. So now the Gemara asks, and why don't the rabbis derive the law from there, as we have shown that it is not a novelty? So the Gemara answers, they hold that even in the case of a pot used on the same day, it is impossible that the vessel does not slightly taint the food absorbed in the vessel. Consequently, the law of purging vessels of Gentiles is a novelty from which general principles cannot be derived. You can use a pot that belonged to Gentiles if you kosher it properly, but we can't learn out from that the flavor of a permitted substance imparted onto a permitted food renders that food prohibited. The rabbis learn it out from the law of the Nazir, that he can't eat anything soaked in wine. So Rav Acha, the son of Rav Avia, said to Rav Ashi, from the opinion of the rabbis, we infer the proper understanding of the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Don't the rabbis say that the term soaked, in the verse of the Nazir, teaches that the principle, that the legal status of the flavor of forbidden food is like that of the prohibited food itself. And this applies not only to a Nazir, but that from here you derive the law with regard to all prohibitions of the Torah. And according to Rabbi Akiva as well, who establishes this term soaked as relating to, as teaching that the permitted substance combines with the forbidden substance with regard to a Nazir, the minimum amount to trigger liability for violating the prohibition. So let us say that from here you derive the law with regard to all prohibitions of the Torah. And this explanation runs counter to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, who applies this principle only to a Nazir. Are we going to establish the principle with respect to the Nazir, and are we going to extend that principle to other areas of the law? Rav Ashi said to him, this cannot serve as a proof due to the fact that the laws of a Nazir and those of a sin offering are from two verses that come as one. In other words, to teach the same matter. And any two verses that come as one do not teach their common aspect to apply to other cases. What is this about the sin offering? We're not talking about the sin offering that a Nazir brings at the conclusion of his term of Nazirs. Now we're talking about one of the principles of bringing any sin offering is that if the meat of the offering somehow came into contact with non-sacred meat, is the offering disqualified? This is what we're examining. The Gemara comments, the derivation that a permitted substance joins together with a prohibited substance in the case of a Nazir is that which we stated. We've been talking about it from the term soaked. And now with regard to a sin offering, what is the derivation that a permitted substance combines with a prohibited substance to form the minimum amount? It is as it is taught in a Baraisa with regard to the verse discussing a sin offering. Leviticus 6:20. Anything that touches in its flesh shall become consecrated. Now, one might have thought that non-sacred meat that touched any part of a sin offering becomes consecrated, even if it did not absorb the taste of the sin offering that it touched. And therefore, the verse states, in its flesh, to teach that this meat is not consecrated until the taste of the sin offering is absorbed within its flesh. So the Baraisa continues, shall become consecrated means its legal status becomes like that of the sin offering itself. Not that you're going to offer it, to the priest to eat. This was non-sacred meat. But it's rendered consecrated in the sense that a non-priest cannot eat it anymore. That is, if the sin offering is disqualified, and then the non-sacred meat that touched it will also be disqualified. And if the sin offering is valid, the non-sacred meat that touched it may be eaten in accordance with the more stringent standards of a sin offering with regard to when and where it may be eaten. And meaning that a non-priest cannot eat it. And the principle that a permitted substance combines with a forbidden substance is thereby stated in the case of the sin offering as well. Consequently, the principle cannot be extended to the entire Torah, as a law stated in two cases and two cases alone is not extended to other areas of law. You have to have a law in order to take the principles of one law and extend it into other areas of the law. What are we seeing? That law that we're borrowing the principle from can't have something utterly unique about it, nor can that principle exist in only two areas of law and two alone, because then they come together and we don't extend beyond that. So, and the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva would maintain that both of these sources are necessary, as neither the case of a Nazir nor the case of a sin offering could be derived from the other. Therefore, this is not a case of two verses that come as one. Rather, they're just two separate principles. For the Gemara elaborates, for had the merciful one written this law only with regard to a sin offering, I would say that the case of a Nazir cannot be derived from it due to the fact that we do not derive the law of a Nazir from that of consecrated items. And this is because the prohibitions of Naziris are unrelated to the temple and offerings, and therefore it is possible that the law in question is unique to consecrated items. And conversely, had the merciful one written this law only with regard to a Nazir, I would say that we do not derive the law of a sin offering from that of a Nazir due to the fact that its prohibition is stringent. In what way? It is stringent as even a grape seed is forbidden to a Nazir, although the seeds are usually not eaten. Therefore, the law of a sin offering cannot be derived from the case of a Nazir, which means that this is not a case of two verses that come as one. Consequently, we can derive a general law from them. And Rabbi Akiva would have answered, In rebuttal of this claim, why are these cases both necessary? Granted, if the merciful one had written this principle only with regard to a sin offering, one would not derive the law of a Nazir from it, as we do not derive the law of non-sacred items from those of sacred items. Certain stringencies and strictures apply only to consecrated property. However, let the merciful one write this principle with regard to a Nazir, and you could derive the case of the sin offering from that of a Nazir, just as the application of this principle to all prohibitions in the Torah is derived from the law of the Nazir. And since it is not necessary to state this principle in both cases, one cannot derive a general principle from them. And the Gemara asks, so what about the rabbis who maintain that the principle that the legal status of the flavor of forbidden substance is like consuming this forbidden substance itself, that this is not limited to these two cases? Would they say to you that both cases are required? The case of a sin offering is necessary to derive the principle that a permitted substance combines with a forbidden substance to form the minimum amount to trigger liability, and this stringency is not extrapolated to other prohibitions in accordance with the principle that one cannot derive the law of non-sacred items from sacred items. And the term soaked, which appears in the context of a Nazir, teaches the principle, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. And the term soaked, which appears in the context of a Nazir, teaches the principle that the legal status of the flavor of forbidden food is like that of eating the prohibited food itself. So since both examples are necessary, they are not considered two verses that come as one, and it is therefore possible to derive a general principle from them. And consequently, from here you derive the law with regard to all the prohibitions of the Torah. Gemara asks, and how would Rabbi Akiva respond to this claim? And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Akiva would say that both cases, the sin offering and the Nazir eating bread, who's prohibited to eat anything soaked in wine, Rabbi Akiva would say that both cases teach the principle that a permitted substance combines with a forbidden substance that they combine together to form the minimum volume or weight needed to trigger liability. But Rabbi Akiva would not derive the principle that imparting the flavor of something prohibited onto something permitted renders a permitted thing prohibited. Rabbi Akiva would not take that law from there. So Rabbi Akiva would say that these two respond that both cases teach the principle that a permitted substance combines with a forbidden substance for minimum measure, and they are two verses that come as one to teach the same issue. And the rule is that any two verses that come as one do not teach their common aspect to apply to other cases. That's what Rabbi Akiva would say, but he lost that battle against the majority. Okay, let's go to questions or comments. On Nazir 37. Load Google Doc, load. There we go. Tom, can a Nazir buy wine during his term? Yes, right? That's what we saw. The Nazir, right? Is he prohibited? Didn't we say that his prohibition? Yeah, his prohibition is on consumption, not deriving benefit. So yes, a Nazir cannot drink wine, but if there's wine on sale, he can go stock up and buy a few cases, even during his term of Naziris. Joseph, a Nazir can derive benefit from grapes. Did not think of that. I just assumed otherwise. So that's what we learned today. Marjorie, if it helps your obsession for this last week, I feel that my life has been as the psalmists, living as a stranger in Meshech, dwelling among the tents of Kedar. Long enough have I been dwelling with those who hate peace. I am for peace, but when I speak, they are for fighting. From Psalm 120. Says Marjorie, being with you and the class live readjusts my mind and improves my day. When I must review the lesson later, it still helps settle my mind on God where it belongs. Thank you for your faithfulness, Baruch Hashem. Thank you, Marjorie. I mean, it really just makes it all worthwhile when I hear something like that from a member of the class. And I'll even say that at the beginning of the class, I had a headache. I get migraines sometimes. And I just, how am I going to be able to teach today? but I'm so engaged in the moment learning with you all that actually my headache went away. So yes, Torah is medicine when you're learning and teaching. Bill, question. Given we're discussing the flavor of a given food being forbidden, suppose a certain man made a vow saying, for the next month I vow I will not eat bananas in the same way that a Nazir would not eat grapes. So the man then goes and eats some candy with artificial banana flavoring. Now, whoa. When we're talking about the flavor being imparted, it has to be the flavor actually imparted by the prohibited substance. So artificial flavor that happens to taste like the prohibited thing is a whole other thing. That is not prohibited, right? There are kosher bacon bits. There's kosher bacon for that matter. They achieve a flavor that's similar to bacon, but of course there's no pork product in it. Some would say, what are you doing? That violates the spirit of the thing. But the bottom line is, if it happens to taste like something that's prohibited, but that flavor was not extracted from the actual prohibited food, then we're in a different category of discussion. But let me say, I cut off your question. With artificial banana flavoring, is the man liable for breaking his vow? So I would say no. Now, because there are two matters at issue. First, when he said bananas, he had in mind that the sort he could get at the grocery store and not the extinct species of banana called Gross Michael. What? From which banana flavoring for candies is derived. And second, the flavor is artificial. It does taste like an extinct banana, but no banana was involved. No bananas were injured in this process. Yeah, so my understanding is artificial flavoring that isn't actually drawn from the prohibited substance does not trigger that prohibition. Sharon, need the flavor come from the prohibited product? If vegetarian, same question. If vegetarian bacon has the flavor of bacon, but is not made from a pig, does its bacon flavor render it prohibited? And my understanding is no. Definitely ask your local Orthodox rabbi. This is the kind of question that's easily Googled, but off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure that as long as no prohibited food was used. Now, kosher food does require a hechsher unless, we're talking about just simple things like produce. But if it was cooked, if it was made in a factory, if it was processed, so even if no non-kosher ingredients were used, it still won't be kosher if it wasn't, kosher supervision. But that's a whole other question. But can, something that tastes like bacon, even though no pork was used, can that be kosher? Yes, it exists. We know that exists. So that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Slight possibility that there won't be class on Friday at noon Pacific. If I have to go to a training, as I've mentioned a bunch of times, I'm part of a security force. I wear a firearm in synagogue. I'm a licensed security guard with insignia and a badge and everything. And we have to do a lot of training, and I might have to attend a training on Friday. That's not confirmed yet, but I'll let you know, God willing, by tomorrow night.